Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, Washington's Whirlwind weeks, spectrum developments, and single-payer system fact checks. Joining us to discuss all of this is AAF Douglas Holtz-Eakin, Director of Technology and Innovation Policy, Jeff Westling, and Director of Healthcare Policy, Michael Baker. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Whew, I feel like that intro is a lot longer than usual, and Angela didn't do me any favors with the triple W's in there, but here we go. We got a lot to talk about today, but before we start, tell us what's been on your mind.
Mostly the housing market. The housing market's an important cyclical phenomenon. That usually upturns are led by housing booms in construction, downturns, pullbacks. This housing market's sort of been dead in the water and isn't showing any life. Be nice to see it recover some, particularly as other parts of the economy are showing some weakness. That'd be helpful. So there's sort of the macro aspects of it. There's also just the ongoing affordable housing crisis, lack of inventory. And, when are we going to deal with this? I don't hear much coming out of the administration on this front. And, I know that there's going to be a HUD secretary, Mr. Turner, who's going to claim that the affordable housing crisis is their number one priority. But I'd like to know what we're going to do.
Yeah, I remember us talking about it. I can't believe it was on this podcast, video, or whatever medium. Somewhere at AAF, we were talking about how they did that study, I think at the end of last year or near last year, about what it would take to get back to, and it was astronomical. I don't remember the details of that, but it was going to take years for that stuff to recover.
And I think they're also scoping out what federal lands you could build on.
Yeah.
So that will be interesting. The federal government does own a lot of land.
Yeah.
Most of it, however, is in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So that's a drawback.
Yeah, it was part of the campaign because I remember that pledge from the proposal from the Trump campaign, and I know there's a few, but yeah, it's something that definitely we'll probably be keeping an eye on, and obviously Thomas does those quarterly chart books, so I'm sure we'll be talking about it again.
Yes.
And like you said, once the administration puts out some proposals, we might have a longer conversation on it.
So listeners, if you're interested, there is a housing chart book always on the AAF website. It's updated quarterly. Gives you the status of starts, mortgage origination, sort of the financing and real activity in the housing sector.
Interesting. All right, let's move on to the whirlwind that's been DC and the start of the 100 days, I guess you could call it, it's been that a whirlwind weeks for both Congress and the administration. So just start by talking us through what's happened in Congress.
Well, the substantive thing that happened in Congress is they passed a continuing resolution to fund the government through the end of fiscal year 2025, which is September 30th. So that's a good news. We didn't get a shutdown. We didn't get anything that would be disruptive in that way. It's $1.6 trillion of spending, a little bit more in defense than last year, a little bit less than had been hoped for by some in non-defense, but no real news in terms of any approach to fiscal consolidation, trying to get spending under control. And, as you and I have discussed, the discretionary budget isn't where you have to do the work. So, the deficit was $1.8 trillion. If you didn't spend any of this for a year, you don't close the deficit. That's how big our problem is. Mm-hmm. So, but we got that done. That's probably the biggest accomplishment. They also have passed a House budget resolution, a Senate budget resolution. Those are the first steps toward getting the reconciliation instruction and then ultimately reconciliation legislation to vote on. Now they have to go in a back room someplace and find something that the House and Senate can agree on, that they can drop on the floor of each and pass, so they have a joint resolution that has the reconciliation instruction. That, I think, is probably going to prove to be a difficult negotiation. Might take a little while. As I recall, they were discussing current law versus current policy baselines in December, and it's March and it's not yet settled. So yeah, getting this thing nailed down is proving to be really hard.
So what you're telling me is it's not going to just be NCAA with March Madness, but it's going to also be DC with March Madness.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
no question.
I've seen a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks about, Ways and Means and Finance looking at current the current baselines and stuff like that. So that seems like that's going to be point of contention, they got to figure that out.
They do have to figure that out. And there are some politics to that. I, for example, think that the current policy baseline, which would just show the TCJA extension in the revenue line, well, if you have that and then you extend the TCJA, you do nothing. Now, that's good news from the point of view of deficits and having to pay for deficits. It's bad news if you're trying to explain how this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread for the economy, because nothing really isn't very stimulative.
Yeah.
So I think they have some political problems. They have some substantive problems.
I think the two other big questions that we have on the reconciliation front would be the debt limit.
Yes,
because we're doing the
we're up
measures.
Against it. We're in extraordinary measures. We're up against the debt limit.
And then
how long can that last?
Yeah.
Not as long as it will take to pass the reconciliation bill. So it's time for Plan B.
Yeah. And then the other part of this, of course, in the reconciliation process is the parliamentarian. Thune and everyone's going to have to sit down with them and figure that out.
Yeah, you hear a lot of things are going to be in the reconciliation bill. The REINS Act is going to be in there. That's a regulation reform, not obviously primarily budgetary in nature. Is the parliamentarian going to pitch that as being not germane? Oil and gas regulations, energy policy more generally, border policy, border money. Some will make it, some won't, and that's going to be an interesting scrub.
Yeah. What was that called? The bird bath.
The bird bath. Yes. And you're the only person in DC who didn't know this, Kyle.
I just don't follow budgets like you guys do. But
how can you not follow? Come now. You lead a very sterile existence. I'm sorry for you. I am.
Moving on. Now, so on the other side, we have the administration and what they've been doing.
Really?
There's a few things to keep track of on what they're doing.
And undoing.
But give us the economic and fiscal updates.
So the doing and undoing.
Yeah.
So I mean, for the administration, the most visible thing is the president's various pronouncements on tariffs. So we have begun the tariffs, 25% on steel and aluminum. We have done the tariffs on China. Those are all done. We have threatened tariffs and then delayed them twice on Canada and Mexico. We doubled them for about 8 hours on Canada, but didn't go through with it. And in general, these announcements have whipsawed markets for sure. We've seen households have a sharp rise in their inflation expectations, a sharp decline in consumer sentiment. That's not yet reflected in the data, but if the hard data start coming in weak, then everyone's going to really pay attention, including the Fed, which is meeting today. So that's been the most visible thing. But the administration is also out there sort of trying to get its plans in place for how it's going to participate in the reconciliation. What is it going to do in the other agencies, and it's a very busy time.
Yeah, by tomorrow we'll know when this goes out. We'll obviously know what the Fed has done, but I mean, what do you see them doing for the rest of the year?
So today's meeting will end up showing no change in interest rate policy and no change in the quantitative tightening, the running down of the portfolio. I think most people can see that coming. What they will have to do is reveal their new survey of economic projections. So the members. So what do the members think is going to happen to inflation? What do the members think is going to happen to interest rates? They've got lots of chatter about inflation pressures coming from tariffs. Do they lean against that? They have lots of chatter about a slower economy and potential rise in unemployment. Do they cut to offset that? Now's when the dual mandate becomes hard, right? You really start earning your money because tariffs are in and of themselves bad news.
Yeah.
And so I think most people are going to be looking at those projections to see what does the Fed think is going to happen.
Yeah, I've heard some rumblings that they might even think about raising at some point.
Yeah, I mean,
which would be interesting.
If you're a serious inflation hawk who really believes in a single mandate, right? It's just an inflation mandate. You're going to make the argument that the best thing for long-term employment growth is, in fact, to not accommodate the inflation. So, so counter this. Yeah, there's a short-run bump, but that's life, and move on.
Yeah, I was talking to Jacob yesterday, and he mentioned that we were talking about how Canada just saw an increase in inflation, probably due to some of the tariff things that have been happening. So it's something to keep an eye on and maybe get some lessons from.
Yes, and Jacob's doing a tremendous job of tracking the tariffs, tracking the evolution of the Trump policy. The Fed versus administration is actually, from just an economics point of view, really illustrative of the importance of providing forward guidance. Everyone's looking for the survey of economic projections so they can get some guidance from the Fed about the outlook for interest rates for the rest of the year and what the Fed thinks is going to happen to inflation and unemployment. What's the outlook for tariffs? Where's the president going? What's the objective? We know the Fed objective is 2% inflation and sustained high employment growth. What's the president's objective? It's very hard to tell, and this has really bothered the business community, to say the least.
All right, well, final question, and I know you've been traveling a lot, so you might not be caught up, but who do you got winning March Madness?
Oh, I have, you're going to like this. I've got St. John's and Duke in the final with Duke winning.
I don't like that because I hate Duke, but now that Bill Belichick's at UNC and I have to be a UNC fan, but I love St. John's winning it all.
I didn't set out to pick Duke. I do this essentially randomly, sort of picking each game as I see it, and it just ended up that way. It is true, however, that my mother is an unbelievable Duke fan, and so if she listens to this, I may be in her good graces for about 38 seconds this year.
Well, Doug, I wore my green tie today just to remind you of the greatest round of 64 game of all time when UVM took down Syracuse. But,
I'm sorry.
I guess we'll leave it there today.
Were you talking to me?
I guess we'll leave it there today. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Jeff, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
So right before we started recording, you were just telling me that your golf game has been a little bit better, so that's a good sign.
Well, it was a little bit better yesterday. On Sunday, I've never played a worse round in my life, so who knows where it's at now.
Yeah. Maybe it's and then obviously March Madness is coming up, so I got to ask before we jump into the Spectrum stuff, who do you got going?
I mean, you got to have Duke at this point.
Oh my God!
I know it's a played out answer, but if you're just picking the winner, you've got to play the odds, and Duke right now to me probably 1 in 4 chance of winning the whole thing.
I'm sticking with my St. J's play.
Well, that's choice.
All right, let's go on to Spectrum.
Let's do it.
We've seen some headlines about Spectrum, and it's forthcoming in the forthcoming reconciliation bill. Obviously, there's still a lot to figure out with that. What's going on, and why should we care?
Yeah, what's going on is essentially the FCC auctions off Spectrum licenses. And what that means practically is that if you have a mobile carrier like AT&T or Verizon and you want your phone to work, they need to be able to transmit signals to and from towers. And they get these licenses from the FCC, and we do it through auctions. And that way we have a market-based mechanism to assign these rights, because they're limited, essentially, because you can't have too many in one spot. Well, the FCC's authority to auction those licenses has actually lapsed. It lapsed, I think, 2 years ago. And we've been trying to get it reauthorized for a while now, and there's been no real path to do that. There's been a lot of kind of disagreements along the way. But the reason it's coming up again is that the reconciliation bill is a good opportunity because Spectrum auctions generate revenue. So that gives Congress a reason to relook at Spectrum auctions and reauthorizing it as a way to pay for some of the tax cuts and other things that are potentially going to be in that reconciliation package.
Interesting. So if Spectrum auctions aren't that controversial, I mean, so why did Congress let the authority lapse? And what's taking them so long?
So this is actually a really good question, and it dives into kind of one of the key issues here is that there's no spectrum, and I don't like using the word spectrum super broadly, but we're just going to use it. There's no spectrum that's readily available right now. These 5G networks, Wi-Fi networks, they're all using these mid-band spectrums, and the biggest holder is the DoD and other government agencies. And the way the structure of our management system set up is that the FCC, which generally regulates radios, has no authority to reallocate DoD spectrum. So you need to have some kind of mechanism on the back end that would allow the DoD to give up some of that bandwidth. Well, to get spectrum reauthorized, you also want to attach with it some kind of mechanism that's going to force DoD to do just that. And so when Congress tried to reauthorize the auction authority, they initially were going to include like a pipeline that was going to designate a specific band that DoD had and say this is going to be licensed. And DoD fought that very aggressively. And as a result, we never saw that reauthorization happen. And the alternative would be, let's just do a clean reauthorization. You run into problems there of, okay, well, now we're going to reauthorize the ability to auction spectrum, but there's nothing available. There's no actual bandwidth that we can make available. So even if you have the authority, if you have no inventory, what are you going to do? So we ended up having the auction authority lapse because we couldn't find that right balance. And also there's tensions between some of the cable folks and the wireless folks, because the cable folks tend to want more spectrum for unlicensed, and that would be your Wi-Fi router, your home networks, your Bluetooth. So there's just a lot of competing interests here, and that has made it difficult for anything to pass. And again, a lot of it's tied to the fact that there's not a lot of political will right now to get it through, and that's why this reconciliation package is so interesting, is because now there is that political incentive to figure something out and make it available. But until we really find a way to get the DoD on board and the other government agencies on board, it's still going to be a really difficult process.
So it's basically a logistics problem. Everyone agrees we need this, but we just have to figure out
devil's in the details. Yeah.
So what are the options for members to thinking about spectrum auction authority here?
So I think there's 3 different options that are available. One is you just do the clean reauthorization that I mentioned, which is the same problem. You don't have inventory, so you can't really make spectrum available. But the advantage of that is that it does give Congress some baseline of revenue, because what's going to happen is the CBO is going to score it and say, well, the chances that we actually auction something is, let's say 20%. That could raise this amount of money. So they'll still get a decent score from a clean reauthorization. And at the same time, if we have strong leadership in the White House, we could still make spectrum available and auction things. We could still do a sharing regimes, which is another big option, where you've got maybe an unlicensed underlay and a licensed regime, and then you share with the DoD or whoever. So there's things you could do, but at the end of the day, if we've seen the DoD be this resistant in the past, I'm not sure that'll really be viable for getting these networks up and running. The next is that kind of pipeline that I talked about, where you specifically name a band. You say this band is going to be included, it's going to be auctioned for exclusive high-powered use, or maybe some kind of shared regime. And we'll get that done by X, Y, or Z date. That tends to score a little bit higher, because now the CBO can look at it and say, look, we have this band, it's definitely going to be auctioned. They'll be auctioned by this date. This is what people are willing to bid. So there's an incentive for Congress to do something like that, because the score would be a little higher. You get more revenue. You can find, you don't need to find that revenue elsewhere. There's still problems there, though. Obviously, number one, you're going to get that same pushback you've always gotten. And number two, sometimes the folks underestimate how much it costs to move those incumbent systems, because we can't let the DoD operations just end. Like I've kind of described it as like, oh, they're just a problem. Well, no, they have a very important function, and they do important things. So you don't want to just get rid of them entirely. And the way you do it is you pay them to relocate. So they'll change their antennas, they'll change their radios into a different frequency band, but that costs money. And the way you pay for it is from some of those revenues. So even if you might generate more revenue, you also have to spend that to relocate. So it might not end up being the ideal solution. And then the final option is something like the Ted Cruz bill, which has been reintroduced in the House. And basically what that does is it sets a target where it's like, in 10 years, the DoD and the federal government needs to make 1,500 megahertz available for auctions. And that is interesting because it gives the DoD and the government agencies the flexibility to come up with regimes that work the best, find the bands that work the best, and make those available. Again, though, the problem there is there's no real enforcement mechanism on the back end. If you don't do it, okay, we're in the same spot we are now. Congress is going to need to do another bill that specifically lays out a band and makes that available. So they've got a lot of options in front of them. All of them can generate revenue, but if you do any one of them, there's going to be trade-offs, and it's going to be balancing the interests of the unlicensed community with the wireless, the exclusive high-powered licenses, and the government users. And it's not an easy task, and that's something I don't envy the members thinking through this right now, but there's definitely a lot of opportunity as well, and it's something I don't think we should lose sight of.
Well, it sounds like that this isn't going away anytime soon, and you'll be writing about it extensively, so people should keep watching and paying attention and have you back on if we need to talk about it. And I'm sure that seems like every time you're live tweeting these days, it's about that, so people can also get your insights there.
Or my awesome tier list, Kyle. People love those.
Oh, the tier lists. We'll save those for another podcast.
Okay.
Thanks for coming on, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's your debut. You excited?
I'm very excited.
So we'll just jump right into things. The American Action Forum recently launched a new series. It's been about 4 weeks now, 5 weeks now.
Yeah, just over a month.
Yeah. So on the single payer systems, tell us about it.
Sure thing. So as you mentioned, last month we launched our series, Reality Checkup: The Truth About Single Payer Systems. And you might ask, why now? Because Americans are largely intrigued and sometimes uninformed about these kinds of systems. Many on the left say that this Medicare for All style single payer system would be great for both the budget and for patients, while many on the right say that this would devastate Americans' quality of care. And that's why we're doing this series, to provide a fact-based comparison about the United States system versus systems around the world, and really try to get to the truth of the matter. And if people want to learn more about all of these facts, they're on our website on our special series page.
Yep, that's the Reality Checkup series page. It's a great series page. Everyone should definitely bookmark that. I hope in the end it's just like, good glossary of information about, what the different, just comparing the different healthcare systems and why it's, this sounds great that and that it might not be all it's cracked up to be, which leads me into my next question. Medicare for All does sound like, universal healthcare, which at least, sounds, again, like it could be a good thing. But how do these systems actually work in the real world is the question.
Absolutely. You're right. Universal healthcare sounds great until you have to get to the part of implementing it, how it's been implemented thus far. We have great examples in Canada and the UK where there are a number of features that are built into the system that are designed for patients to limit care because they have to control budgets. A lot of these are longer wait times, inconsistent access to doctors, and a oftentimes slower uptake of advanced therapeutics for diseases like cancer that we've been accustomed to in the United States, and that if we bring that sort of system here, we just need to be clear-eyed about the impact that we would be importing to our system.
Yeah. So what are some of these facts that point to the U.S. system being superior than to a single-payer system?
Absolutely. I'll start with the cancer drugs, which I briefly mentioned. We in the United States launch the most number of cancer drugs over a decade. When you look at that, more than any other country in the world. In Canada, over the last few years, they've announced only 11 new drugs compared that were all approved in Canada, the EU, and the United States. By comparison, we've launched over 200.
Wow.
And so right there, we can already see that it's really great to be in the United States system of care. And with cancer incidence on the rise, we want to maintain that access for our patients. Another great example is kids, children's hospitals. Kids are always a priority in healthcare, and for good reason. As you know, they're our future. And so we in the United States have the best access to the best pediatric hospitals in the world. Yeah. If you look at the top 250 hospitals across the globe, most of them, over a quarter of them, are in the United States. This is, of course, adjusted for our population, but the countries with the next most are South Korea and Germany.
Wow.
While great countries to be in, I'm sure, and to visit, I would like to have any kids that I have to come to the United States to receive care.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the biggest point here, right? And a lot of what we're seeing in these posts is that it's the access to care that's the biggest issue, and the biggest reason why we should be very careful about implementing the Medicare for All. I know Sally Pipes just wrote about Senator Sanders' wonderful Medicare for All plan. So, yeah, again, it's just all about making sure we maintain the access to care and the great life-saving pharmaceutical drugs that we have here.
Absolutely. We know that medical innovation is one of the shining stars of the science community. Most of those very innovative things are both discovered and then launched right here in the United States. And while we don't know what the world is going to bring, I think we'd like to maintain our access to those for as long as we can.
Mm-hmm. So again, all of this is on the Reality Checkup. We launch it every Tuesday, and we have about what, 2 more months to go, 3 more months of content, something like that.
Yeah, we absolutely try to get it out on a regular basis early in the week so that you have something to talk about at your work happy hour on a Thursday. And we're covering a bunch of different topics. Obviously, single-payer healthcare is an incredibly complex and important thing to analyze and discuss, and we don't want to shortchange any of these facts that I mentioned earlier in the chat. And so we are methodologically going through and looking at different aspects. And so at the end of this series, you can have a whole picture to talk about single-payer healthcare and why. And if it should be here in the United States, and if it shouldn't be, why it shouldn't be.
Interesting. Well, thank you for coming on and talking about all this. That was a great conversation. And I've asked Doug and Jeff this question, so I'm going to send it to you now, too. Who do you got winning March Madness?
That's a hard question. My heart wants to say the University of Michigan.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my mind thinks that it won't be them. They'll probably get upset in the first round, and so I'm probably gonna have to go with Florida or St. John's.
Yeah, I of course went with St. John's, as many of the people in the office know. But as I don't know if you heard on the Monday meeting, everybody just has one objective really in the office pool, and that's just to beat me. So you now add another layer of somebody trying to beat me, which is.
Listen, we all need goals, and I'd like to think hopefully that's attainable, but I have a sneaking suspicion that you're a little more informed on this than you're letting on.
Well, good luck. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.